Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got just a fascinating young gentleman to introduce you to tonight, Pierre-Jean Esmieu-Fournel, who I've pronounced it wrong again. I apologize, but we're going to call him PJ for the rest of the hour. He's a gentleman who has a very profound view of American foreign policy from his perch as a senior executive in the finance industry and numerous other industries in Paris, France. He's worked and lived in Paris, in London, in New York. He's exposed himself to business around the world, and I think he's got an interesting perspective that's I may not agree with completely or at all. We don't know yet, but it's going to be one interesting hour. So let's listen to PJ. PJ, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you so much, Brian. The last name is Esmieu-Fournel, but that was close. That was very close.
Esmieu-Fournel, that's what I said. Pierre-Jean Esmieu-Fournel.
That will be for the next TV show.
Okay. So tell me, what do you want to talk about? You were eager to get on the show and talk about American foreign policy and all of its mistakes. So tell me, what is your thesis, sir?
Well, I love history in general, but I have a special attention to our dear friends, the US, and what is it that they've done after the Second World War. I always find it so, it explains so much what's going on today with the difficulties we got in Ukraine, in Taiwan, all over the place, and to some extent also what happened to Israel. So I find it so interesting to discuss that. Before I get into what happened after the Second World War with some examples, I just want to focus our attention to how they closed Second World War. I don't know if everybody knows, but the vast implication of the US was not on the European front. It was on Asia, and in particular, of course, against Japan. In this context, there's a lot of discussion that I won't get into about the first atomic bomb and the second one, but something for which I'd like to draw attention to everyone. In between the two drops of the bombs in Hiroshima on the 6th of August, in Nagasaki on the 9th, Russia declared war to Japan, and they wanted to do so in order to be at the table of negotiation against Japan. And what Truman did, he approved the first and the second bomb. He did that very shortly, within 72 hours, but he did so because Russia was going to be at the table of negotiation if the second war has lasted longer. It was a very important point. Stalin has sent 2 million people in North Manchuria, and that was to invade China. So the play of Truman was so interesting, so powerful. He was, I won't say right or wrong because it's a judgment, but he took decision. And it's not fair to recognize that most of the people at that time considered that he was stupid, that he was not intelligent, and he couldn't drive the end of the conflict. So just to say that this guy was, I think, a very good president. And after this example of the end of the Second War, let's jump onto some...
Okay, so hold on. Let me understand your point. Your point here is that that Russia was amassing, did you say 2 million people?
2 million troops north of Manchuria, yeah.
2 million troops ready to invade Japan.
And they did, not Japan, to invade North China, which is Manchuria. So Stalin sent troops south of his border in Russia to invade North Manchuria, where Japanese troops were stationed.
Okay. And you think that Truman dropped at least the second bomb so that Russia would not be at the peace table?
Exactly, so that the end of the conflict will be very quick, and as a result, Stalin would not have a table at the negotiation at the end of the war between the US and Japan.
And you think he did that because what? That Russia would have demanded a lot of countries, a lot of an Eastern Bloc, a Western Bloc comparable to the Eastern Bloc?
It was, and that was so contrary to FDR. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was perceived by the American, it's still the case, as one of the best presidents. But he had a very good opinion of Stalin. He was hammered during Yalta in 45, just before he died. On the other hand, nobody talks about his deputy president, his vice president, who became the president, Harry Truman. Harry Truman made the good choice. He had learned from the secret services what was going on in Russia and what was the play of Stalin. And he made the decision in order to avoid Stalin at the negotiation and preserve Japan after the Second World War. That was amazing. This guy was so clever.
So I have a different point of view of FDR. I think FDR knew that the American public would not stand for huge amounts of American military losses, and via land lease and other strategies, ensured that Russia fought the vast majority of the war against Nazi Germany for the Allies, and lost the vast majority of people. And he probably could have invaded and created that second front in Europe a year earlier, as lots of people have said, but he waited. And one of the reasons why he waited is to ensure that Germany was weakened by, losses by Russia. And so, he was very smart in saving American lives and financing the war that other people were running against Nazi Germany.
I think you're perfectly right. It was right. In particular, when he decided to wait until Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 41 to go to Congress and within 24 hours get a full support to declare war against Japan, and as a result, 2 days later to Nazi Germany. But I just may, if I may say, the mistakes he made was about his vision about Stalin, and he got screwed up by Stalin so many times, and the future proved it. But what was good is that his vice president, that nobody expected to be a good president, took great measure. It was a very good president, in my view.
Okay,
but
sounds good.
It doesn't say that FDR wasn't bad. FDR wasn't good. He was a very good president, but he made this huge mistake to think that Stalin spoke the truth, which was not the case.
PJ, we're going to have to take a break for some messages. We're going to come back in 2 minutes with Pierre-Jean Esmieu-Fournel.
Fournel, you got it.
Fantastic. A Parisian investment banker, merchant banker, investment banker, businessman who's got a really interesting view that he is desperate to get out about American foreign policy. We're going to take a break for 2 minutes and be back with PJ. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Pierre-Jean Esmieu-Fournel. And Esmieu, understand, it translates, is it better? I understand. And so that's maybe helpful in understanding how smart PJ is. He is a gentleman that I did business with back 22 years ago, I think it was, PJ. And PJ's got an incredible experience working in London and Paris and in New York in investment banking, and as a chief financial officer for a major specialty pharmaceutical company. He now runs his own merchant bank where he finances companies and raises money for them around the world. And he's therefore got great experience in business and in politics and in finance in the world, but particularly obviously in Paris and Europe and in Britain and in the United States. PJ was desperate to get on the show and talk about American foreign policy. We've been talking about the end of World War II, and he's got an interesting view on Truman. PJ, tell me the rest of the story.
Right. Thank you so much. I love it. Last point about Truman, because I think he was the best president, one of the best, if not the best president the US ever had. Second example is about the Korean War, just starting in 1950, 5 years after the Second World War. And he's the one that fronted, that was having big discussions with MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur, who was given the responsibility of the Korean War between 50 and 53. And MacArthur did not like Truman. He thought he was stupid again. He couldn't make decision. And he went to him because he had to, in order to get approved to launch a nuclear weapon on the 38th parallel, which was the frontier with North Korea. Truman was the only one in the cabinet to say, no, I don't want to do that. So I appreciate that decision. I think, to give it the truth, he was a good president. Okay, now we start
So,
about
so what do you think would have happened if they had used nuclear warheads in the Korean War?
Well, we have to remember that the implication of China was very different from what happened during the Cold War, because China was within the borders of North Korea, not only helping North Koreans, but also playing a role with soldiers that were within the territory of North Korea. So it would have meant that some Chinese may have been killed by the weapon. And remember that the Chinese had the H-bomb shortly after 49. So it was right at the time of the conflict. And the H-bomb was about 10 times, 100 times bigger than what happened in Hiroshima. So that would have been very, very dangerous because, of course, Chinese could have retaliated with their own bomb.
So you think that Truman made the right decision in not using nuclear weapons in Korea?
Well, it proved that there was minor losses in this war. I think we're talking 50,000 U.S. troops that were killed during this conflict of 3 years. Yeah, I think it was obviously the right decision.
It's what, 65 years later, and there's still a division at that in that country between North and South Korea. And North Korea is probably one of the biggest threats after Russia and China in the world.
After, as you say, Russia and China, we live in a very different world now since the end of the 90s. We live in a world with a three-polar world. We have far ahead, we have the couple of the US on one side. In China now, who's playing the number 2 by far in the world in terms of power, and then only you got number 3, Russia. I don't think North Korea is a threat to say to the West, just because their economy is down. There's nothing you can do about it. Of course, they have nuclear power, but if they ignite, if they decide to launch their missile, we will see it very, very quickly. So it's a risk. It can be monitored, and that's how it is now, but it's not as big as China. China is the risk now, according to me.
Okay, go on.
Well, an example of the mess that has been made by the US, and I love the US. I worked there 5 years, enjoy my life. And by the way, we all know that without the US, we should be in France as a department or a part of Nazi Germany. So that being said, let's talk about the Pigs Bay very shortly. Pigs Bay, that's 1961. Remember what happened. Castro took power in 58. He made he started negotiation with the US in order to get food because it was a disaster, things like that, to be helped by the US. The US said no. And that's why he went to Russia for help and food because he couldn't feed the country. And it was a very important decision. So he decided to go through Russia. And that's why the American, with the new president, just a very new president, JFK, decided to invade Cuba by the south with a beach called the Pigs Bay. And they sent about 1,000 old guys from Cuba that were not happy with this socialist regime. And it was the biggest disaster of the whole 20th century. They stayed not even 24 hours in the country. Everybody got in jail in the country. It was a mess, zero success, and it was stopped after 24 hours. That's one of the bad examples of foreign policy from the US. Of course, just after this one, in 62, we can talk about the nuclear crisis that everyone knows about. I just want to point out something that few people know. Do you know, Brian, the reason why Nikita Khrushchev sent U.S. nuclear weapons by sea to Cuba? What was the reason why he did so?
The Americans were putting nuclear weapons close to Russia.
Wow, I love you. Because few people know that. It was unveiled by the CIA information only 20 years or 15 years ago. So yes, the right reason was in Turkey, to be specific, the Americans with JFK has produced some launch sites for nuclear weapons to be sent to Moscow. And the time of this bomb, this US bomb, to reach Moscow or the south of Russia was less than 5 minutes. As a result, the concept of the equilibrium of nuclear retaliation didn't work out, because the US could have sent a nuclear missile and Moscow would not have had the time to respond. And that's why Khrushchev felt it was an existential threat. And that's why he decided to do the same to the coast of Florida when he sent the nuclear arsenal to Cuba. Nobody knows what happened after. There were the famous 13 days. Everybody knows about. We were on the verge of a real crisis, but it went out because in the face of the world, Khrushchev said, well, I'm going to get out of Cuba with my missile and I'm going to bring them back to Russia, which he did. But he negotiated in the back door with JFK so that JFK removed his missile from Turkey. So the winner of this situation was not the US. It was Moscow, because Moscow managed to remove the nuclear missile that were not far away from their front. Another example, very quick one, the Contras in Nicaragua. Well, we all remember when you're 50 or 60 years old, like we are. Sorry, Brian, we're getting old now. But everybody remember the testimony in front of the Congress of Colonel Olivier North. The complexity of the Contra situation. So that's Nicaragua. Basically, what happened is that the Americans found a way not to be visible and help the portion of Nicaragua that was against the Sandinists, against the communists. And they did it in a way which was so stupid. They decided to send weapons to Iran. And yes, I'm saying to Iran. And these weapons were used to release 7 hostages. And then the sale of the weapons had been used for Nicaraguan anti-communist parties to acquire weapons and to kill in a disastrous way. This country was really on the limit of what's possible. And that led, at the end of the day, it didn't work out. It was a complete disaster. Reagan was on the verge to quit the job on his second mandate because of this. And it killed 30,000 people. A lot of torture was also at the time. So really bad situation. Chile, another poor story in the 73. The president, Salvador Allende, was I don't know if he was a good guy or not, but he was elected via his democracy. And the country was taken aback by the CIA, who took over this situation and put a dictator in Chile. A very bad move, a lot of bad discussion. We're talking 1 million people that have lost their house, about 100,000 get killed, a lot of rapes, bad decision. Argentina, también, in Argentina. You remember something weird? In Argentina, it's called Las Locas de la Playa de Mayo. Do you know that?
I don't.
Okay, that's the Spanish for the crazy woman from the place of May. Why? Because when the US supported a bad regime, a dictatorship in Argentina, the mother of the people that were it was horrible because the regime took the life of all these people but didn't say so. So it was torture, and then they were killed, and then their body was buried. So nobody knew where they were at that time. So the mother of these people, a lot of people, we're talking probably 30, maybe 50,000 people. So they came to this place every May, every year, to say to the dictatorship, please give us our children, even if they're dead, please give it back to us. So to a regime, it should never ever have been supported by the US. There's no record on that. I'm just going to give you one thing, which is a true fact, of course. The IMF, which is largely controlled by the US, and the US, 1 week after the dictator took to power in Argentina, they wired $250 million US, which was a lot of money at that time. Again, they were on the wrong side, I think, of the equation.
So I'm trying to understand your thesis here. So that your thesis is that during the Cold War, the United States supported people in opposition to communists that shouldn't have been supported, and got involved in numerous different wars, incursions, problems, issues indirectly, and all those times ended up being a problem for the United States. Is that your thesis?
That's my thesis. It's supported by a lot of facts. I can go on, but I think to understand what happened with the US since 1953 rather than 45, because my point is that Truman did a good job until 53. So let's talk between 53 until now.
So what are you suggesting, that nuclear war is the better approach than these indirect supports of dictators that were not communist?
Not even in my remote dream. That's impossible. And I prove it, Brian, because we talked about 5 cases, 5 countries where the Americans should not have supported a dictatorship. In none of these countries, there were the nuclear bomb. So it's not the issue. I think the issue is very simple. It boils down to the 19th century with the 5th president of the US, Monroe. And Monroe issued at that time, back to the late 19th century, he developed the famous Monroe Doctrine, which is applicable, according to Kissinger, until the age is 90 or 2000 for the US. And this doctrine says, basically, we have to protect our frontiers to a certain extent. And this extent goes to Canada, which is arguably not really something that could fight against the US. But if you go south, you understand that the entire South America falls under the doctrine. That's why all the presidents who agreed on the doctrine decided to support some bad regime with a lot of torture, a lot of people were killed. And it was a bad decision because it was awful for all these people. And in some instances, it's even worse because the American policy was based on the support of the Congress. And in order to get the support of the Congress when they attack a very far regime, is to prove that this regime had shot for the first time. And that was the case in Vietnam. It was unveiled by the CIA books very recently, but I don't know if you remember, to the time of Lyndon Johnson, is the one that accelerated the presence of the US in Vietnam. At that time, they supported their intervention in 1964, I think, by saying that a war vessel that was in the Tonkin, which is the east coast of Vietnam, was sunk by Vietnam's bullets or Vietnam's action, North Vietnam action. So that's the communist. Well, it has been unveiled that it was done by the US. So the US sunk their own ship in order to justify their attack to Vietnam. This is amazing. This is just amazing. It should never, ever have happened. Of course, you remember what happened? Nothing, because the US left in 75 with Nixon and left 1.5 million people going into boat people. Half of them died. So I'm talking 700,000 people get killed. And during the conflict, 55,000 GI were killed, as many were injured, and about 1 million Vietnamese were killed. This is so much of a disaster. And all that was, the truth was transvested by Lyndon Johnson. You can read my piece on LinkedIn about Lyndon Johnson. It's a disaster. He was the most corrupted US president.
Lyndon Johnson was the most corrupted US president, really?
That's correct. When he left office, I don't know if you know that, he left with a fortune in current currency, it's about $1 billion. But when he left the office, he had a value of own value of $100 million, which is close to $1 billion now. And he was, then it becomes difficult to discuss now. We can do it, but there was some implication with JFK assassination. It's possible. He hated the brother of JFK, Bob Kennedy, who was the head of justice until '68. He was the most important shareholder of the company that was building the helicopters for Vietnam. So it was a huge market, of course. So many things on one head. And
I haven't heard this. I haven't heard this allegation before. It's something that you're going to have to educate me on. But it's probably different than your thesis on American foreign policy. And so, you know, the theory at the time was I think it was called the domino theory, is that if you lost North Vietnam, if you lost North Korea, you know, you would continue to lose countries around the world that would become communist, and too much of the world would become communist. And so therefore the United States and I believe there was a famous Secretary of State at the time that had this thesis that, and I followed undoubtedly by Kissinger, that had the thesis that they had to have a bright line, and that you couldn't have any more countries slip into communism, and that Vietnam was one of those key dominoes that you wouldn't allow to topple over. So you obviously disagree with that thesis.
In that case, frankly, what was the future at that time for us, which is the past now for us, 1975, which is the year when the US left South Vietnam. Well, they promised to leave a protection with helicopters, protection with spare jets, and they left. They didn't play by their word. But anyways, what happened is in favor of my argument, because in 1975, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, so it became fully communist country. And it happened very, very fast. And then there was this very difficult situation for at least 1.5 million Vietnamese. So had they not been involved in the conflict, we would have been in the same situation.
You said if we hadn't been involved in this, if the United States hadn't been involved in Vietnam, North Vietnam still would have taken over South Vietnam, but there would have been 1.5 million people's of lives that would have been saved.
Lyndon Johnson decided to put GIs in Vietnam, not only to train people, but also to fight in 1964. So the real presence of the US was between 1964 to 1975. That's 11 years. When they started, there was a frontier between North and South Vietnam. When they left, there was nothing left. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure of my argument here.
We're going to have to take a break for some more messages. We're going to be back with Pierre-Jean on his thesis about American foreign policy in just 2 minutes. Interesting conversation. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking about American foreign policy tonight with a international guest coming to us from Paris, France, Pierre-Jean Esmieu-Fournel, who's a very experienced businessman, investment banker, corporate executive, financier from Paris, from Britain, from London, from New York, where he's lived and worked in each one of those three countries, and now raises money for companies worldwide. And he's been interested in talking to us about his critique of and thesis about American foreign policy. And we've been chatting a little bit about what happened post-World War II, with numerous different fights the United States got into to try to support dictators and other people that were against communism. And I think what Pierre-Jean is saying is that every single time the United States got involved, the countries ended up being situations where hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people ended up dying, and the countries didn't end up becoming democratic and staying free. They ended up often either becoming dictatorships or becoming communist anyway. So Pierre-Jean, back to you. Tell us the rest of your story.
I want to shed light with something more recent. That's the Iraq War. So we know the context, 9/11, and we know that the US, with a small coalition, invaded Iraq with a lot of troops, a lot of money, on one argument. The argument was, and it was presented at the United Nations to justify the war against Iraq. That was because there was some massive destruction weapons
of mass destruction. Yep.
Mass destruction in Iraq. Well, the future proved that there was none. So if you look at what happened after that, you're talking hundreds of thousands of people getting shot. A lot of people in the Middle East have lost their confidence in the US, or even more in the West, in general. So that was a very bad decision. Again, like in Vietnam, initiated with a big lie. The big lie, for information, if you read the memoirs of Colin Powell, he stated very clearly that was a very bad decision, and it was based on a big lie. Afghanistan, it has been called very often as the second Vietnam. Well, we're talking at the pinpoint of 2012, we're looking at 100,000 GIs in Afghanistan, against with one purpose at that time, which was to kill or to get rid of the Taliban, because the Taliban were supposed to be the one behind 9/11. Of course, it was wrong. Again, it was a lie, an obvious lie. And the situation lasted nearly 20 years. And if you care about money in business, well, you should be really disappointed with this decision. It was the most expensive conflict in the 20th century, for the 21st century, for the US. It went up to 1 trillion. 1 trillion is $1,000 billion. So that's just amazing. The last one I want to share with you is actuality. It's Ukraine. Well, Ukraine, it's about the same situation as 1962 in Cuba with the missile. In Ukraine, we can remember some key elements in the story. I'm talking 2008, so that's about 15 years ago. In 2008, there was a meeting, international meeting, about the situation in all this part of the world, Ukraine, Poland, all these previous East countries. It was in Romania, and there was all the big chief of the West present at this meeting, together with Putin. He was present also. And the head of NATO, who is American, said to everyone during the Congress, we're planning, he didn't say we will, but he said we're planning on making Ukraine and Georgia a member of NATO. At the very moment he said so, and that's a true story, at Bucharest, 2008, President Sarkozy, president of France at that time, Angela Merkel, Chancellor, President, if you wish, of Germany, and the chief of the embassy of USA in Moscow, the three of them immediately took the mic and said to the world, this is an act of war against Russia. Why? Because of the reason that I explained for the nuclear situation in 1962. We were talking about putting nuclear missile potentially, because that would have been a NATO country in Ukraine, and that would have left less than 5 minutes for Moscow to retaliate in case USA were to send a US nuclear missile. So that was the reason. You have to know also that when he didn't get a response, because of course Putin at the same Congress say, hey, I need backup. I need you to step back and tell the world that you will not put Ukraine, Georgia in NATO. He did so, and he was not listened to. And then 3 months after, he invaded Georgia, and 12 or 15 years later, he invaded Ukraine on the same premises. Just for you to know, the invasion of Ukraine was in February 22, on the 22nd of February 22. And just 2 days before, 48 hours before, Putin wrote officially to the US and to the head of NATO, asking them to state that Ukraine will not be a NATO country. And Biden just took his new job at that time, and he found interesting to respond, I do what I want. And of course, the war started. I'm not saying that Putin is right. Starting a war is always a big mistake, no question about it. But still, I think the policy of West was not the one that should have been the case. We should have played with them. In particular, and that will be my last point, in particular, when you identify our current situation strategically, politically in the world, and as I said 10 minutes ago, we have three powers now. We have the US, number one, no question asked, for sure. And very close to them, we have China. And then very far from them, the first two, we have Russia. I think we should have played a role with Russia and try to find some kind of alliance. I know it's difficult, but we should have found a way to have them with us and not Russia now being close to China.
So there's an American Republican presidential candidate, former businessman, who is saying that what the United States is doing, supporting Ukraine, is pushing Russia into the hands of China. Sounds like you agree with that thesis.
I would only push you guys, everybody who's listening to this interview, to read on the internet or his books, John Mearsheimer. John Mearsheimer is the responsible, is in charge of at the University of Chicago about the international policy. He's so intelligent, and he puts everything in perspective since the 18th century. And as you say, he explained exactly the same position that you mentioned about Ukraine. Yes.
So you're saying that that the cause of the Ukraine war was a NATO, the chief of NATO, that was suggesting that that NATO would expand to the Ukraine and Georgia, and that was something that Russia couldn't stand, and because of that, and because they weren't assured enough by Biden and by the Americans that NATO would not extend into Ukraine and Georgia, he invaded Ukraine to protect himself.
That is completely correct. It's just one small glitch. Let's remember what happened about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, about the Orange Revolution. And what happened is that Putin did a very bad game and put his friend as head of the state. And again, the election were tempered with a lot of frauds. But anyways, he asked for three things at that time that were not completed. Putin asked, in this case, that NATO could not be, that the country could not be form of NATO. Second, not going into a pure democratic regime, which is difficult to, of course, to approve. And the third one that he asked for, not to be part of the EEC, which is the European organization. So he's got three requests. But I think if we help him on one of them, which is the biggest one for our defense and our future of our kids, that's the NATO, and we should get rid of it. It doesn't make any sense. I don't think anybody understands that. There is this famous Article 5 in NATO contract, and Article 5 basically states that if one of the countries that belongs to NATO is attacked by a third party, then all the countries belonging to NATO will fight a war against this one. Do we want to fight a war for Ukraine, one of the most corrupted countries in the world? Do we want that? I don't want to for my kids, no question about it.
Well, right now, Ukraine is not part of NATO, and, you know, frankly, NATO and the United States are doing something similar to what you said FDR did correctly. They are financing the war, but the people that are fighting the war, and maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but are Ukrainians. And so therefore, you know, what one of the Secretary of Defense said, I can't remember his name right now, said was that this is the war that's going to weaken Russia more than anything else, and it certainly seems to have done so. And so again, what the United States and NATO are doing is financing a fight against Russia without being involved directly themselves.
Yeah, I have two comments very shortly. The first one, nobody wonders what's going on with Crimea. Crimea was invaded by Russia in 2014. Well, it was like the Anschluss in 37. The Anschluss in 37 is when Hitler invaded, quote unquote, Austria. There was no fight. Everybody approved because 95% of the population in Austria was German speaking. It was the same for Crimea. So the 2 million people in Crimea are not fighting against Putin to recover their land and belong to Ukraine. The second thing is, I don't trust that Putin wants to invade Ukraine. Of course, I do understand and acknowledge that he made an incursion in Ukraine, but I don't think he wants to control the whole country except the east side and Crimea. Why? Because when he started the war, it was, we got that on the satellite, so we know it's true. He had 180,000 troops to invade by the north of Ukraine. It would need 2.5 million soldiers minimum to invade the full country. And nobody brings this problem, which is a problem of intelligence. Why does he why would he try to invade a country where he's not putting the necessary clout behind it? I think he doesn't care. He just wants to make a point that if the US continue to emphasize Ukraine being member of NATO, it will continue.
But remember what he's done is he's made NATO more unified than it's ever been, and NATO and now NATO is considering expanding to Ukraine, which, you know, I think that while they never committed not to previously, and that may have been a mistake, according to you. You know, right now, I think that they're on a path toward being included in NATO. Sweden, Finland, you know, are now in NATO, which didn't happen previously. NATO is unified, and the EC has got a path to accepting Ukraine into the European Economic Community. And so, therefore, if anything, what Putin has done by this invasion is he's sped up this process and made it more positive that it's going to happen. And it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And your comment about language, you know, all of Canada speaks English. That doesn't mean that that the United States should take over Canada. Same thing with the United Kingdom, obviously. You know, I have been to Austria numerous times, as you undoubtedly have. They're very proud Austrians, whether they speak German or not, and you know, the Sound of Music is one of the best examples of that. There were people in Austria that were adamant against the German takeover of Austria. Ukraine and the Russian-speaking portion of Ukraine were very proud Ukrainians, and you know, based on the interviews I've done and the people I've spoken to, they've stopped speaking Russian. They're speaking and learning Ukrainian and become more proud Ukrainians. And they were forced to speak Russian because since the end of the Second World War, the only education they could get was in Russian. And you had people where you know, generations of grandparents and great-grandparents spoke only Ukrainian, but then the kids and the grandkids only spoke Russian because that's what they were taught in school. When I was in Kyiv, you know, there were half the city was speaking Russian, half the city was speaking Ukrainian, maybe comparable to Montreal, where half speak French and half speak English. But even though we've had our challenges, people were working well together and did business together and went to plays together and would go back and forth between Ukrainian and Russian. So I don't think that's any justification for invading a country because they speak the same language.
I say, Brian, there's no possibility in my mind to justify a war, even the one that initiated Putin. I'm against this way of negotiating, which is beyond negotiation, of course. That being said, within a year from now, maybe two, we will be in the same situation as Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. It means that
we're stuck.
The US have tried something, and
we're stuck. But at least today, it's not NATO forces that are actually giving up their lives, and the alternative of allowing Russia to take over either 20% of Ukraine or all of Ukraine, depending on whether you're right that they only want the eastern and southern portion, or all of Ukraine, which is certainly the risk. I don't think is palatable. Anyway, we got to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments with Pierre-Jean and his thesis about American foreign policy in just 2 minutes. Stay with us.
Brian,
welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We got Pierre-Jean with us today, coming to us from Paris, France, and we've been chatting about American foreign policy and his critique of it. Well, and I think we could go on all day and have an argument. But Pierre-Jean, you said you wanted to say something in conclusion about Donald Trump. Go for it.
Yeah, before I do so, just one reflection. You can love someone, you can have a dear friend, and at the same time tell him that he made mistakes. And that's my position about the US. Now, the thing about Donald Trump is very interesting. You know what he said 6 months ago? He made a public statement and he said, if I'm elected, Ukraine war will stop within 24 hours. So everybody interpreted that his position will be to come to Putin and officially and say Ukraine will not be part of NATO. That's my play. Let's wait 1 year or so, but I think that's going to happen. Sorry, that's what's going to happen.
Well, interesting thesis. So I don't disagree with you that I think a lot of American indirect involvement in supporting dictators and unsavory individuals worldwide as an attempt to stop communism has been a mistake. Whether it's the Bay of Pigs invasion that you started with, and or Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., and direct involvement in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq has cost huge amounts of American lives and a lot of other lives. And so I think that you're right in that regard. Last time we chatted about this, I pointed out Canada did not get involved in Iraq. And you may remember the United States was very mad at us. And there was one of the biggest problems between Canada and the United States at the time, because the Prime Minister at the time, Jean Chrétien, didn't support the idea of weapons of mass destruction being there. And so therefore did not support Canada being involved in the coalition that attacked, though we did get involved in Afghanistan. I'm really worried that this is the start of World War III. And the fact that Hamas is being celebrated in Russia today, and potentially supported by Russia and Iran, really concerns me. And I think that this idea that has been floated in the last couple of days of Russia needing desperately a second front in the war, such that the American public and American military and financial support would be split away from Ukraine, such that they supported Hamas and maybe indirectly, but indirectly via Iran, the invasion, I think is worrisome. And if I go back to World War II, and use your example of the attack into Austria that followed with the attack into Czechoslovakia and the attack into Poland, I could say that was duplicated with Crimea, eastern Ukraine, and then ultimately invasion. It sounds like there's a lot of the same three-step process, and then Italy got involved and the Mediterranean got involved, and that's certainly what happened in World War II. And I worry that if Iran, Syria, Jordan get involved, Lebanon, etc., Hezbollah, we're going to have a similar, maybe not North Mediterranean, but South Mediterranean, Middle East involvement in this war. And then I'm scared to death of China saying this is the right time to attack Taiwan. And so I got to ask you, given your thesis, what would you do? What would you recommend if China attacks Taiwan today?
Right. I'll comment if you want in 30 seconds about Hamas, but now about your question about China. My point is the following. China is the true number 2 player, hegemony. We call that hegemony power in the world, just behind the US, not far away from the US. And there's a lot of information about what's going to be the force of attack of China 10 years from now. Well, most of the people I've read are considering that they will be ahead of the US in 10 years from now. So we'll have the US with the 6th Fleet, as you know, that's the 6th Fleet, which is around the shores of China. And we've got Taipei, which is 80 miles away from the coast of China. I don't think there is a situation now because there is a strong force from the US compared to China. But as I say, I'm very skeptical. It's 5 or 10 years from now, and this is a very short while. So yes, I'm very, very negative about what can happen. I think it is far more important than what's going on in Ukraine for us, the West. And I think we should turn down this tragedy as soon as possible, one way or the other. But for China, it's a long track. And if we can get Putin with us and not on the other side of the fence, well, I think we're going to achieve something very, very big. Why don't we say to Russia, coming back to your comment about Hamas, why don't we say to Russia, to Putin, hey, my friend is a bit exaggerated, please, we're going to satisfy you. Ukraine will not be part of NATO. But on the other hand, you play close to us in your relationship with China. And in particular with Israel, you get out of all your traffic and I don't know, whatever you do with Hamas. So these two conditions could be negotiated. I haven't got a clue if it can work. Of course, I'm not in the happy few to know what's going on. But I think it's a good negotiation to play on these 2 points against satisfying what he's looking for.
Pierre-Jean, thank you for joining us today and sharing with us your thesis. It's interesting. My uncle, a guy I thought of very fondly, was chief of staff to the admiral of the Seventh Fleet during the Korean War. And I had numerous different arguments with him over the dinner table over decades of time in regards to the U.S. strategies in Korea and Vietnam, etc. And he was a true believer in the domino theory and fought in the Korean War in that regard, and spoke perfect Russian and Japanese and lived in Tokyo and traveled through those waters and airspace quite a bit. You know what? There's a lot of Americans that strongly believe that point of view of the domino theory, and that's obviously one of the reasons why there's been as much military involvement and foreign affairs involvement over the course of the last 60 years. It's an interesting conversation. I look forward to coming to Paris and sitting down over a good meal and chatting further about this. Thanks so much for sharing your ideas with us, sir.
It's been a real pleasure.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. You know, one of the things that I really enjoy about doing this show is meeting fascinating people and keeping in touch with fascinating people like Pierre-Jean and chatting about things. I don't always agree with what they have to say, but it's thought-provoking and interesting. And, you know, one of the things that we don't do often enough is listen to other people's points of view, and to listen to a senior business executive from Paris who's lived around the world and obviously studied history in great detail, and his own point of view on what's going on, rather than just the same talking heads that we listen to, or political spin doctors that we listen to on a regular basis, is very refreshing and probably really helpful. That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.